Welcome to the Biotrove podcast. We've been waiting for you. Sit back, relax, and find out what is happening in biotechnology today. We hope you enjoy your podcast. Hi, my name's Liz Parrish. I'm here with Biotrove, and I'm sitting with Randal Koene, neuroscientist, founder of Carboncopies.org. Today's topic is whole brain emulation. Thanks a lot for coming, Randal.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
So what is whole brain emulation?
Whole brain emulation is a method for doing something, and I'm going to explain what that something is first before talking about that particular method. A popular term, at least from science fiction circles and now also in some futurist circles, is the idea of mind uploading. How could you take a mind and then put it somewhere else? It's a bit of a vague term, and people never quite know what to think of it. Does it mean you're just storing a mind somewhere? Is it doing something? Then there's mind uploading, downloading, sideloading, offloading. It just gets too confusing. So to be more scientific about it, we decided that we first had to decide exactly what the objective was. The objective is that right now, what's creating our mind, the brain, the emergent phenomena of the brain or the mind, is being produced in a biological organism. It's being produced in a biological substrate. But ideally, it would be possible to run the same sort of functions that make the mind happen on other kinds of substrates. So we call this substrate independent, substrate independent minds, or in short, SIM. And when we say independent, we don't mean without. It's not like a ghost, but platform independent. It's kind of like platform independent code that can run on a Mac or a PC or other things. And there are many different ways you could think about getting to substrate independent minds. But the one that seems most feasible right now is this concept that we call whole brain emulation. An emulator, if you know what an emulator is on a computer, for example, it's something that will allow you to run something intended for one platform on another. So, for example, if you have a program that works on your Macintosh, if you have a Mac emulator, then you can run that program on a PC, for instance. So similarly, whole brain emulation means that you take the way that the mind runs on the brain right now and you emulate how that brain works, how that neurophysiology and neuroanatomy works, so that you can run those same functions on something else.
What's happening in neuroscience today?
So we're definitely not there yet because the brain is enormous. It has between 80 and 100 million neurons and trillions of synapses in it. This is not something that today's technology can handle yet, and nor does the science itself really understand everything about what's going on in that neurophysiology, neuroanatomy. But there definitely are some important steps. And I think today the biggest steps are the ones that allow us to get more data out of the brain, both about its structure and its function, and also the development of technology that actually looks into how can you replace specific functions that are going on in the brain. How can you make prostheses that replace certain functions? And we're not just talking about prosthetic replacement of, say, the control of a limb or the prosthetic replacement of a misfunctioning retina or cochlear implants to take care of hearing problems. So really on the exterior of the brain, we're also talking about what we call cognitive neural prostheses, so things that are deep in the brain. And there's this great example of technology developed by Ted Berger's group down at USC in LA, where they've created what is basically a somewhat constrained, but still very good example prototype of a prosthetic for the hippocampus, a specific portion of the brain, which was tested successfully in rats, is now being tested successfully in primates, and within 3 to 4 years is supposed to be tested in humans. And they're taking the technology forward into other areas of the brain as well. And we can talk more about that in a moment, but I just wanted to point out that in addition to looking at what is new in neuroscience here and which sort of technologies are pointing the way, you also have to think about why those technologies are really important and applicable to this idea of how could you do whole brain emulation. So there's a necessity to look at it from the top down, kind of as a problem of what is it? How do you get there? What are the problems for getting there? Why is it so difficult? And how could you feasibly do it? Breaking it down into simpler steps. And that's where you get this connect between the theory of how is it possible and the technologies that are emerging as a trend right now. And I hope we can get to all of those while we go through the rest of this discussion.
So I guess what people would really want to know is, do you exist? Do you continue to exist in a brain emulation of who you are?
That's not just a science question for a neuroscientist, but it's also a philosophical question, I think. What does exist mean? What does it mean to be? What does it mean to be a particular person? What does it mean to continue to exist as a particular person? These are all somewhat separate but related things. So, first of all, my personal view is that being is experiencing. So, the only thing I really know about what's going on right now, the only thing that to me is being, is the fact that I experience being in a world. I experience sensing things, processing stuff, things pop up in my mind, emotions, all of those experiences. That's for me, that's being. So you'd have to ask, does experience continue? Would it be able to experience something in an emulation?
I guess the way that I would think about that is, would it be able to continue to create thoughts or learn?
Absolutely. I mean, if it were not able to create thoughts or learn, then it wouldn't be an emulation of what the brain does, because that is what the brain does. So those are exactly the processes you're trying to capture. When you make an emulation of something, you don't just try to capture the data that is the state of the parameters of whatever you're emulating, but you also want to capture the processes. You want to capture the dynamics. What does that do to that data? How does it go from moment to moment? So if you make a successful whole brain emulation, in principle, you should be able to predict from this time to, say, 1 millisecond further on, what should the next state of that brain be, to be something that could have happened in the biological version of that brain. That would be a real emulation.
What would be the difference between mind uploading and AI?
So artificial intelligence, I guess that spans a lot of different areas, but the word artificial already says that. It's meant to be any form of intelligence that we can create, something that we define as being intelligent. Again, there's that little issue of what does that mean really when we use terms like intelligence? How do you define that? But I'm not going to get into that just now. I think the big difference is that an artificial intelligence could be anything that does something we consider intelligent. So say, for instance, something that can tell you the best route to some location. So in a sense, you can say that even a device that helps you drive somewhere, like the devices that we currently all have in our cars, is a kind of artificial intelligence. It's very limited and narrow, but it's an artificial intelligence of some sort. It does something intelligent. Then you can take that further and say, how do you make something that is very general in the form of its intelligence, something that can maybe do many different tasks instead of just one? So it needs to be able to learn how to solve new tasks. That's really the kind of the big threshold, the thing that people working in artificial intelligence try to do, is try to create things that are that capable. But still, it's really alien compared to us, in a sense, compared to what we think of as human intelligence, because that can be something completely different, with different goals, with different ways of thinking, without the same considerations that we have, without the same sort of emotions attached to it, and other aspects that we consider human intelligence. So when people talk about artificial intelligence and brain emulation, or making models of how the brain works interchangeably, they often don't really separate out the fact that what you try to do when you're emulating a brain is you're trying to replicate exactly how something works in not just human brains as a model or as a template, but in a specific brain. So for example, you'd like to be able to build a prosthetic replacement that you could put into the brain of someone who had a stroke, so that they would be, once again, fully functional and feel like their own selves from before. And that has to really suit whatever that human brain was previously doing. It can't be some alternative way of, I don't know, just recognizing objects. If you want to replace a piece of the visual system, if it doesn't fit well with how that person used to see things, if it didn't fit well with their understanding of the world and just what certain colors meant to them and stuff like that. So there's definitely a distinction between trying to make any kind of artificial intelligence or trying to research how to emulate what's going on in a brain.
If we're emulating the human brain, And then in tangent, we're also creating artificial intelligence. What do you think these two technologies would think of each other?
That's really hard to guess, isn't it? Um, but I think we can make, at least we can think of it in a few ways. We already know something about how we think about artificial intelligence because we have some forms of artificial intelligence in the world today, and we certainly have a way of viewing it. And generally, we just see them as a tool of some kind that we use to whatever our purposes are, and we assume that that's the way it's going to stay. But then, of course, we're only at the very beginnings of AI development. Now, if you look way into the future and you consider some form of far advanced artificial intelligence that could rival our abilities in terms of being able to tackle new challenges and being able to think about interesting problems and maybe have even their own goals in some sense, because you can imagine that they start to develop goals by thinking about things, then I can imagine that such intelligence will also have some ideas or opinions and thoughts about us. And it's really hard to guess where that will go, because it's not clear whether, for instance, their relationship with us would be one where they have some kind of need, some sort of dependence on something that we provide them, something that is not necessarily material, but that is somehow important to them. Or if it is something that to them is very alien, where they go, well, that's some other species that has its own goals. Why should we care? We have this beautiful other stuff that we think about as artificial intelligences. It's hard to imagine. It's very hard for me to imagine. But I do worry sometimes about possible future scenarios, and I worry mostly then about, are we going towards a future in which we choose to maintain a clean separation of some kind between human development, human progress, human society in a sense, whatever we become, and our machines that we develop and that then begin to develop themselves, and where machines begin to develop other machines? Is that separate? Or will we choose a path where there is more of a merging so that we both advance and share a lot of the same capabilities, share a lot of the same problems and insights, which to me feels, at least from the point of view of security for our species, or knowing that things will be okay, that we don't have to think about machines as somehow becoming competitors, that in that sense it seems more desirable at the moment. But to be honest, I don't really have a lot of insight into that, and I don't know who does really.
I know that we think of, humans being the most intelligent species on the earth. How much do we rely on human faults? How much would they play into whole brain emulation?
So I'm not exactly sure what you mean by that. How much do we rely on human faults, or how much do human faults matter in order to make it seem really human?
I think that it's our nuances that make us human. And I think it's the way that we sort of stumble into knowing that's different. I wonder if that's what will set this sort of technology apart from AI. I think initially, even computers can only think how we teach them.
Right.
But essentially, or maybe in the future, they will teach themselves and come up with clearer, faster paths.
Possibly, but we don't actually have any evidence that they're going to be any better at finding clear and good paths than we are. I mean, it's an interesting thought, and I think it comes a little bit from early science fiction, where we always think of, there's the Vulcan or Data or somebody who's somehow perfect and never makes a logical mistake, and humans are these imperfect beings that make mistakes all the time. But I'm not sure that that actually makes any sense, because machines make mistakes all the time. That's one of the big problems why developing, for example, artificial intelligence that's good at recognizing objects is difficult, because they make mistakes all the time. So I think making mistakes isn't unique to humans. And if that translates into faults, flaws, character problems, whatever, probably it does once you connect up all the complexity of something like a human being or an equally complex artificial being of some sort. So I think that flaws will exist. They may be very different in their nature. Who knows? Yeah.
Yeah, when I think about it, I think, there's logic, and those are things like Data and Vulcans, and then there's the nuances of human and the character. And sometimes when I think of those things, I think of faults and little things that we do that extrapolate other areas of our personality that are not completely logical. They don't fall on that path.
Yeah, I actually think that that is a really important topic to think about. It's not just a matter of thinking of what's the difference between humans and artificial intelligence, but when you think about personality characteristics, reasons why people do things, you're starting to think about goals, purpose, stuff like that. And when you really think about it, when you dig deep, it becomes very hard to find any kind of truly logical, derivable thing that you might call a good purpose or a good reason for something. Because ultimately, when you think about it from the universe's perspective, if you try to take an outside perspective as if that were possible, then can you even say that there is any purpose or reason why we're here? Is there a purpose for existing or wanting to continue to exist? Does it make any logical sense, or is it just a drive, a desire, something that sort of gets forced upon us by selection? Because obviously only those creatures that were naturally selected to have a drive to continue to exist are still here, because the others just didn't have that drive. But that doesn't mean that it's logical.
How far are we from this type of technology of whole brain emulation becoming prevalent in society and something that people could use?
So in terms of timelines, it's hard to say, because timelines are influenced so much by what we put effort into. And are we going to get distracted by something else? My personal feeling is that if the amount of, say, global economy, global infrastructure, and global science that exists today remains present for another 20, 40, or 60 years, we have a really good chance of getting to the point where brain emulation is possible, maybe even applicable and being used in some sense. The reason I think so is because the actual technical problems involved are certainly not insurmountable at the moment. They're just difficult. If you look at the brain as a huge collection of processes that we don't know very much about in terms of how they're interacting with one another, you also see that we have ways of approaching so-called black boxes, things that we don't know exactly what they are and trying to define what they do. Often we'll look at what's going into a system like that and what's coming out of it, and then we try to explain how input's being transformed into output, and we call that process system identification. If you're trying to describe how a human being works or how a brain works just by looking at it that way, then basically you're doing behaviorism, which is what a certain trend in psychology was. But because the brain is so full of elements, so full of components doing stuff, it becomes impossible to make a very good model of what's going on in a brain just by looking at it from the outside, because there are so many latent variables in there, so many latent functions that you just don't happen to observe during that period of time while you're looking at what's going on, looking at input and output. You could look at it over its entire lifespan and not really figure that out. But what you can do is you can take this problem and break it down into many smaller problems. So you say, okay, the brain is composed of lots of little pieces, and maybe we can find out what each one of those little pieces does individually, describe that function, and if we know how they're interacting with one another, then we can say how it works. That's why doing brain emulation in the end really amounts to breaking down the brain by looking at its structure into all the components that do talk to one another and components that don't. In neuroscience, we call this mostly connectomics. That's the term that embodies high resolution structural identification of what connects to what. Okay, so the other pillar is that when you know how all those components are connected, you still need to know what each one of them does. So system identification is still necessary. And the most reliable way to do that is to actually look at the activity of that little system. So for example, if we assume that we're looking at it at the resolution where we know which neuron's connected to which, that's connectomics, then we'd like to know, how is this particular neuron in one location responding? What's its activity like? What does it look like as a shape? How do its synapses respond? If you want to do that, you need to be able to record from those neurons. We do that in neuroscience, and you have a number of different approaches. There's the very low resolution version of, say, an fMRI, where you look at an entire brain and you get some idea of the global activity, but that's not enough to get down to the same resolution that we're just trying to break it apart into from the structure point of view. We also look at the details of what's going on at individual neurons using electrodes. You can put now up to 100 or maybe even 1,000 electrodes into a brain. Mostly, of course, this is either done in vitro or in animal studies right now. But you can put electrodes in to study many neurons at the same time, but it's still a very small number compared to the number that are really involved in processes in the brain. Very small number.
Would we need a computer chip for every neuron? And if that was the case, how big would this machine be that would emulate our brain?
No, we don't necessarily need a computer chip for every neuron. What we need, first of all, is just access to the data, because we need to do the recording. And I think the biggest things happening in neuroscience right now, because in the last 5 years, the biggest thing happening was this advance in connectomics, is the advance in making new ways of recording from neurons at high resolution, large scale, all over the brain at the same time. And there are a number of technologies that I'd love to talk about in just a second. But to address your question about the having to replace each neuron with an individual chip, it's true that you could replace parts of the brain one by one, and it's an approach that is actually likely in a sense that we'll be making replacement parts for pieces of the brain before we make whole brain emulation of the entire brain possible and plausible. So I'm sure this will happen in some sense. Think about that chip I was talking about, the hippocampal neuroprosthetic, is one example. Now, it doesn't replace a single neuron, it replaces a whole bunch of neurons at the same time. It took a slightly bigger black box to look at, not just a single neuron, but a batch of neurons, a small section of an area in hippocampus. You could do that. Of course, it's also likely that as we begin to move towards real whole brain emulation, that we will be able to record from many places at once, come up with models that represent larger regions or the entire brain, and model that in a separate hardware platform well developed for that purpose. Initially, when you're studying small animals like the fruit fly Drosophila, it makes sense to do this on supercomputers that we have right now, because they're available and because you can easily change the models you're using, the software models, so it's very adaptable while doing research. But ultimately, you'd want to replace that with hardware that is suited for the types of functions that you find through this modeling work are most commonly being used. And we know that when you get really efficient at it, we have an example already in the human brain. You can do all of these computations on something like 20 to 40 watts of power. So you can have a very efficient implementation, ultimately.
Do you think that when this technology gets closer, there'll be a rush for something like the Human Genome Project, but it'll be like the Human Brain Emulation Project, where we'll start mapping brains, and then we'll want to map other species' brains? And, do you think it'll go like that? Or do you think that by having the understanding of one brain, we'll be able to upload anyone's mind?
Those are actually two really important questions. I think the one I can answer with yes. I think that it makes sense when you look at how these things happen, that if you can show, for example, that we've learned how to do an emulation, not just of, say, the retina or hippocampus or something like that, but of an entire fruit fly, like the fruit fly brain. So you have all of the pieces working together. Then it makes absolute sense that people will say, oh my God, look, this is possible. And then there's a rush, a scramble to be able to do this for mammalian brains, because really the only big difference between the two is scale. Neurons are pretty much neurons. Sure, there are some differences between types of neurons, but from the point of view of the kind of technology that you need to build these emulations, to do system identification, they're not really that different. So when you have the technology to do it for something the size of a Drosophila brain, in principle, you have the technology to do it for a larger one, except you might have to figure out how to parallelize your process better, how to make it a bit more efficient. So there will be a scramble at that point.
A rush for the first brain emulation research center to entirely map the brain. Very cool, kind of like a mission to the moon. Can you tell us about the specific technology that's being used to do this type of research?
So I think you're asking me about this functional recording stuff now. That's what you're asking about. Some of the most interesting work there is really how can you get data from the brain at about the same scale, at about the same resolution that the brain itself does? What does the brain do to get at its own data? What it does is it has very many tiny little sensors. All of those little synapses, those synaptic receptors, those are really small sensors able to tell what's going on near them, what's happening to a neuron that they're connected to. So what you'd really like is that approach instead of brain imaging from the outside, which will have to impart too much energy to the brain if you try to ramp up that resolution much higher. In other words, it could cook the brain. That's not very good for you. Or some other approach like using regular electrodes where you have to stick a whole bunch of electrodes in. It displaces a lot of brain tissue. It's surgery. There are infections, things like that. This is not pleasant. You don't really want to do that at large scale. But if you can have things that are so small that they don't disrupt the environment around them, they don't disrupt the cells around them, and yet they can detect what's going on, and basically they work as a cloud of sensors, then there you have a possible solution. And I'm not talking about nanotechnology here. This isn't about nano robots because that's still a whiles away. We're not even that good at building macro robots. So who says we're ready to build nano robots that can detect things from cells? But there are really both electronic and biological approaches to making really tiny sensors that can deliver information to the outside working together as a team, as a hierarchy. And there are groups currently, for example, at MIT, Harvard, and UC Berkeley, who are working together in a consortium of sorts that's called the ProBAM group, Pro Brain Activity Mapping. They're trying explicitly to look at what kinds of technologies can we develop to get at 1 millisecond sample rate resolution data from every single neuron in a piece of tissue or an entire brain. And they're explicitly looking at all the possible hurdles, which technology can get past that or can't, what sort of hybrid technologies can you develop by putting different solutions together that get around problems. And the most promising ones right now are either a biological approach called a molecular ticker tape, where DNA is being used, synthetic DNA, as a recording medium, as a little tape that gets longer and longer inside a cell by repeating a piece of synthetic DNA where you know exactly what the code is supposed to be. And every time when there's a change in the voltage inside that neuron, the number of errors in this replication of the DNA tape changes in correspondence with that. So by looking at the errors on your known synthetic DNA, you can tell what was the activity of the cell in that time. That's one way of looking at it. Another biological approach is connected to something that was recently very popular, optogenetics. Optogenetics is a way of stimulating cells using different frequencies of light after those cells have been genetically modified or raised from a specific line of animals that have a genetic modification so that they're more sensitive to those frequencies of light. But now there's also an equivalent being developed for recording, also using a genetic therapy approach. So there's a biological set of tools for this, but there's also an electronic set of tools. At the same time, there are devices that are on the scale of about the size of a cell of a neuron. So they're shrinking down from prototype sizes of about 100 microns right now down to 20 to 10 micron, which gets you close to the size of a red blood cell, that are able to detect the activity of a cell. They're able to detect voltage changes and somehow deliver that. And the delivery mechanism is the biggest difference between the approaches that the different labs are taking. At MIT and Harvard, they're looking mostly at using infrared frequencies for the communication power and detection of what's going on in the vicinity of these tiny probes. Whereas at UC Berkeley, they're using ultrasound because ultrasound has the nice property that while it travels through tissue, it doesn't get absorbed by the tissue much, so you're not causing heating up of the tissue that's there. And they use a piezoelectric crystal as the main component of these probes. The piezoelectric crystal changes its resonance frequency based on the field potential, on the voltage that's near the neuron. And then if you ping it with ultrasound, then that carrier wave, that ultrasound is modulated according to the resonance frequency. So you get an idea of what's going on right there at that neuron. And they're so small that you can use very many of them in the tissue and not disrupt it. So it's not a surgical procedure as such. It can stay in the tissue, and you can have very many of them all over the tissue so that you can hopefully map what's going on with every single neuron. And the progress there is really great. I was at a neural engineering retreat at UC Berkeley just in December, And one of the main professors working on this told me it's going faster than they had ever hoped for, faster than any other neural engineering project they did recently, because it turns out their assumptions, their design assumptions, were very close to the experimental reality. And so they're looking at taking what they currently did in vitro and starting their animal trials with this process in June, actually. So there's some quick progress happening.
Our first prototypes, or maybe our last prototypes of this, would they contain anything biologic? Would we want to keep any of the biologic cells alive within this box? I guess, that would be something that I would wonder about. At what point would, I picture brain in a box. I think we've all seen that,
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there are definitely people who are thinking specifically about keeping brains alive in a box, because that's also interesting in some sense. Say, for instance, if you have a paraplegic who would like to be able to walk again, if you could just attach their brain to a new body, their brain is still fine to function, and there you have a wonderful solution for that. So there are reasons to do that. Now, when we think of substrate independent minds as a goal, the reasoning behind it is that sometimes biology isn't the optimal solution. For instance, in environments that we were not naturally selected for. We've evolved to exist in this biosphere. Our biology requires this biosphere. If you were to try to live in space, that's quite different, for example. And the same with different challenges that we're not really ready for. Our brain operates at a certain speed and recognizes certain types of input. So, dealing with big future challenges, being able to thrive as a species over vast amounts of time and space requires a lot of adaptability. That's why substrate independence, being able to move to different kinds of implementation, is important. I'm not saying that biology isn't sometimes the best choice. It may very well be. The question, would we have to or would we want to keep certain pieces of biology alive, even in a scenario where you have some kind of whole brain emulation or vast neuroprosthetic stuff going on, is really one of, well, is there something unique, something that is not emulatable, that exists in biology, that you would have to continue to carry along in order to make sure that that is still there? And some people propose that there may be, and the proposals, they go in various different directions, but none of those have yet struck me as being very convincing, partly because no one has yet really come across with a specific task, an experiment, some sort of demonstrable thing where they say, this is a well-constrained problem we can look at, and we can show that we cannot possibly do this by simulating the function of the neurons that are there. There is no way that we could ever do that. There is something that is outside of that realm that is necessary to make it possible. That's one side. There's never really been a demonstration of some such problem. And the other is that the evidence for explanations that say, well, the biology does something unique, they tend to focus on something like quantum processes that they suppose may be going on in neurons, or on some other irreducible complexity down to the lowest levels from the system to the atoms, but never quite show where is that that part where that matters to the function. They don't really demonstrate that there's a justification for the theory, for this notion. So it often sounds more like a desire, a wishful thinking that there would be something unique, something different that makes it impossible, which to me sounds not that much different from thinking that we're unique in the universe, as in the Earth is the center of the universe, kind of the chosen ones in a way. The wishful thinking part is nice, but it doesn't really correspond to a good scientific theory or a reason for thinking there's a problem here. So right now I don't see the need. And I kind of think that substrate independent minds is a good thing if it's really independent of the substrate. So I hope that there isn't that need, but we'll see.
Would having a whole brain emulation of yourself be like having a child, or do people feel that there would be transcendence into this machine when your body passed?
It's more of a question, I think, of how much is it like having a child. Everything's a matter of degrees. So we're assuming here a scenario where you don't transition into a whole brain emulation, I think, because you said having a whole brain emulation, so you're still there and you've made an emulation of yourself that is going on and learning something,
Yeah, I'm
experiencing
thinking you have
things.
to make a conscious effort to emulate your brain. How do you go about doing this? What do people predict? Is this thing running
Yeah.
with you in life until your physical body passes, or is this something that people do at the last minute if the brain is still functioning?
Yeah, this is really another whole realm of questions and interesting topics, because the truth is that you can imagine many different scenarios for getting there, because ultimately what you want is something that functions the way your brain works, the way your mind works, the way your personality works, and that is you. But how to get there? Many different ways. Either you could be replacing parts of yourself while you're still alive, neuroprosthetic replacement one bit at a time, and you could get there. Okay, that's kind of like the ship of Theseus issue. If you keep replacing the planks of a ship, is it still the same ship after all the planks have been replaced? That's a philosophical question, and there's one route. Now, the other route, for instance, is that you develop an emulation that runs simultaneously with your own brain, that each neuron is replaced by another neuron and it produces the same output. So basically, you're creating redundancy. And in that case, uh, you are coexisting with some other process that is duplicating what's going on and connected to you. And then if you sever the connection at some point, okay, there you go. That's your emulated self. Or you could have a process where, say, you are cryonically frozen, or you are suspended, I should say. Frozen's kind of makes kind of the wrong impression there. Or have your brain preserved by some other means, say plastinated. This is something that the Brain Preservation Foundation likes to look into. And that after your death, your brain structure is scanned. And from having learned a lot about brains over, say, previous periods of emulation and neuroprosthetic work, we have a huge library of exactly how every cell works, and we can recognize what every cell is so that you can take just the structure, not having to do this functional recording, and recreate something that works. So then you could even take someone who was already deceased, take their brain, and potentially bring back that person by emulating their brain at that point. There are all these different routes for getting there, and each one of them throws up other questions, many of which we don't know how to answer yet, such as, is there anything real to the sense of personal identity? Is there a difference between me here or me being emulated there, or my 12 other copies? Are they all me? What does that really mean? You have to start thinking about that in other ways then. Also, self-continuity. Does it matter if I was suspended for 20 years and then I get turned on again? Is it possible to still be me, or does being suspended and not continuously active somehow make me disappear? What does that even mean? Do we disappear every moment because the universe is a quantum universe and so they're all distinct quanta? What does it all mean to say things like that? Or is that all just an illusion? Is it just something we make up, but in reality it makes no difference? That's not clear, and I can't really take a position one way or another. But you can see one of the beautiful things about this is that doing science and engineering in that area means you actually end up getting to experiment with and toy with and explore those questions, which otherwise you can't.
It's kind of also there's the nature nurture issue. So if we look at genetics, we could maybe say what you might have been predisposed to act like or view the world, whether you had schizophrenia or not, or something like that. But there's the specifics of personality, and are we going to have to wear something like an inward Google glass, something that's actually watching us and watching our brain, and what are your reactions to these scenarios, and how do you react when you see a pink bird flying in the sky, or it's this is beyond most of our thinking. I think I'm glad you're working on this.
I'm glad you brought it up, because before even jumping into this, people usually have a whole set of assumptions about what they think life means, about what they think personality means, about what they think it means to copy something or to replicate or to continue living or to extend life. All sorts of things, they have assumptions about what it means. And often they're not very deeply thought through. And you can punch holes into them everywhere because you can think of other scenarios where it's a little bit different. And so it's worth at least thinking about. And even with the question of, if my emulation continues to exist, no matter which process got me there, if that's me, how different is that from, say, for example, having a child and teaching them to have your values and to use like in the past when people became a carpenter, if their dad was a carpenter, to even take over their skills and basically be them. You're just senior and junior. So how different is that really, that kind of survival versus survival as the emulation? And I think it's a it's really a gray area. There's a spectrum that you can look at that at, because even in ourselves, I'm not exactly the same person I was when I was 5 years old. So, and if I had just jumped from when I was 5 to now, you could say there was a distinct change. These are two different people. And it's just the fact that there is some sort of line of continuity connecting us.
Yeah, and if we didn't have the ability to grow and think, if whole brain emulation existed in the 20s, dealing with that person now, if they were sort of locked in time with their thinking and their patterns of their speech and how they viewed the world, it would be notable that you were in the room with someone from the 1920s.
Right. Yeah. But all of these issues, I find them interesting, and I think they're worth exploring. And maybe there are even some right and some wrong answers to some of them. Maybe. But this leads me to that other thing that I like to make clear, which is that seeking out substrate independent minds isn't really just about life extension. It's not about how can I continue to exist longer into the future and then dealing with all of these questions. It's largely about how can you make a species ultra adaptable so that it can handle many different types of environments, many different kinds of challenges. So for me, when I think of substrate independent minds, I see it as an incredible capability to be able to exist in many different types of substrates, to run in many different ways or at different speeds, or to enhance how we think, to bring in extra faculties that we didn't have before, to keep up with our machines, for example, to merge with all of that. The ability to become a type of species that is not just suitable for life here on Earth, but suitable for so many other things. That, to me, is the real promise of this. And this is why I think it's ultimately extremely important for any truly advanced species that really means something and has an influence on a scale that means something in terms of both time and space, because we've really only existed for a tiny blip and only in one tiny incy-wincy corner of the universe. So what do we really mean at the moment in that sense? What have our accomplishments gotten? What has our creativity really created from that perspective? If you really want to be an influential, intelligent species that contributes, eventually you need to get to something like substrate independent minds to make that possible. And for me, that was what got me there, because I didn't start out thinking about life extension. I started out thinking about limitations. I was, as a child, as a teenager, I was creative and I liked to write. I liked to do music and all kinds of other stuff and explore and travel. And it occurred to me very early on that we have a lot of limitations. There are many things I wasn't capable of, or I didn't have the time to do it all. And then when you start thinking through where the limitations come from, sure, physical limitations, but often the physical limitations are just something that contributes to a sort of a boundary on what you can experience mentally, because it maybe doesn't allow you to jump 20 feet into the air, so you can't find out what that's like. But really, it's the mental limitations. So ultimately, it's all about experiencing, and that's all the brain. So then it kind of led to understanding that that's where you solve all these constraint problems, all these limitations, is dealing with the limitations of the mind. And substrate independent minds, or mind uploading if you like, is a way out of that, or is a tool that leads you to all of the capabilities that you need so that you can at least be on a track, on a route towards understanding everything and being able to create anything. It's not that we'll ever get there, but you could be on a route to doing that.
So probably a lot of people listening now are thinking, well, how do I get involved? How would I learn more about this? What do you suggest?
Well, one thing you can do first, of course, is go and look at the website where my organization tries to keep things put in one place, carboncopies.org. That's one place you can go and look. And there's also a Facebook group called Carboncopies where the newest stuff keeps popping up, and I try to curate it fairly well so that it's not full of irrelevant junk, but it's really topical. And we also have a group of volunteers who are trying to help out to make this effort bigger, to help much of the stuff that I actually do on a day-to-day basis, which is road mapping, trying to figure out how does the top-down goal, when you break it down into all of its problems, when you look at what needs to be solved, how does it connect with the developments that are going on bottom up. If you look at the cutting edge labs, the cutting edge research, if you know them all. So create networks with all of those researchers, with all of those labs, much of which has been done in the past few years. But of course, this gets iterated over and improved. And we're doing an iteration of the roadmap right now, actually, because of some of this great work that came out in the functional neurosciences, the recording from neurons recently. So road mapping, networking, being able to bring in sponsors, bring in funding to areas that are not researched enough, that are gaps where there are key pieces that need to be solved. If you are a scientist, if you can work your way towards that, of course you can help in that capacity. If you are someone who wants to help out philanthropically, there are many ways to help out in that way as well. All of those routes, they can be reached by just communicating with me through carboncopies.org. That's the easiest way to do it. But I guess a lot depends on exactly what your own goals are, where you want to go, and what you also think makes you happy, something that you like to do. If you want to help out, people help out the best in the ways that they enjoy doing the most, because when you enjoy what you do, you can spend a lot of time on it and never feels like work. It feels like something fun. That's for me too. I mean, the reason I do this is mostly because I think it's fun. And you're going to do the best job. You're going to be an expert in it. You're going to contribute the most. So if you want to help out, also think about where you would like to help out. What would you like to do? What are your favorite activities?
This is one of the things that I love about new technologies is they're always driven by the smartest people in the world. And yet they're open for everyone to come in and take a look and meet these people, see how they can help, see if it's money, time, effort, their skills. Once these things really get on the road and become owned by big business, those days are over. And I'm very happy to be meeting with you today. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
You can find us at biotroveinvestments.com. Thank you for listening.